I've done a lot of camping over the years, but nothing has ever shaken me like what happened in the Smoky Mountains National Park. I used to laugh at those so-called RV camping horror stories. Thought they were just internet nonsense. But after what I went through, I don't think I'll ever go back there. It happened last fall. I had taken my RV deep into the park near a secluded campground off a winding forest road. The drive was peaceful. Golden leaves, mist rolling through the trees, that crisp mountain air. I parked, set up my spot, and got a fire going. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend. Around midnight, I stepped out to use the bathroom. The fire had died down, and the woods were so silent it felt unnatural. No wind, no rustling, nothing. That's when I heard it, something moving in the distance. Not an animal, not even heavy footsteps. It was more like someone dragging something through the leaves. I turned my flashlight toward the sound, but I didn't see anything. The beam just vanished into the darkness between the trees. Still, I got that weird feeling, like I was being watched. I shook it off, went back inside, and locked the door. At around 3 a.m., I woke up to a sound that made my stomach drop. It was this low, slow scratching, coming from the outside of my RV. At first, I thought it was a branch, but then it moved, a deliberate, slow scrape against the metal. It circled the RV, stopping just under my bedroom window. I didn't breathe. I just lay there, frozen, listening. And then, something whispered. It was low, just outside the window, but I swear I heard it clear as day. Come out. I lost it. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it through the window. Nothing, no footprints, no sign of anyone. But the moment I turned the light off, there was a soft thump against the door. I was done. I grabbed my keys, fired up the engine, and peeled out of there without even packing up. I drove straight out of that park and didn't stop until I hit a gas station miles away. When I finally got out and checked my RV, I found something that still haunts me. Long, deep scratches running down the side of the vehicle. Like something had been circling me, reaching out with claws? I don't know what was out there that night. A person? An animal? Something else? All I know is that I'll never camp in the Smoky Mountains again. Never. I love camping, always have. But after what happened in the Smoky Mountains last year, I don't think I'll ever camp alone again. I had been on the road for about a week, traveling in my RV, stopping at different national parks, and just enjoying the quiet. The Great Smoky Mountains were my last stop before heading home. I planned to stay for 3 nights at a lesser-known campground deep in the woods, away from the usual tourist spots. I wanted solitude, just me, nature, and the crisp autumn air. I arrived around late afternoon and set up camp near a small creek. The place was empty, no other campers, no sounds of nearby RVs, just the trees swaying and the water trickling by. It was perfect. The first night was peaceful. I made a fire, cooked some food, and sat outside listening to the sounds of the forest. The air was cool but not too cold, and for the first time in weeks I felt truly relaxed. Around midnight, I went inside my RV, locked the doors, and fell asleep. But then, at exactly 3:17 a.m., I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. The RV was silent, nothing seemed out of place. But something felt wrong. I reached for my phone, but before I could check the time, I heard it. A low, muffled whistling. It was coming from the woods. Now, I'm not easily spooked. I've camped in isolated places before, heard all kinds of weird animal sounds at night. But this was different. The whistle wasn't random. It had a rhythm. 4 notes repeated over and over. I sat up, listening, my pulse quickening. The sound was distant, but getting closer. I turned on my RV's outside lights, hoping it would scare off whatever was out there. The whistling stopped. For a few moments, there was nothing, just silence. Then, from right outside my RV, maybe 5 or 6 feet away, I heard something whisper, "You shouldn't be here." I froze. Every hair on my body stood on end. The voice was low, breathy, like it was coming from someone standing just beyond the light. I grabbed the knife I always keep by my bed and slowly moved toward the window. The blinds were down, but I could hear movement outside. Soft footsteps circling the RV. I wanted to believe it was just some local messing with me. Maybe another camper playing a prank. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case, because there were no other campers. And then, something knocked on my door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I didn't move, didn't even breathe. The knocking came again. And then, from the other side of the RV, another voice, different this time, higher pitched, whispered the same words. "You shouldn't be here." My hands were shaking. I didn't know what to do. If I opened the door, I had no idea what would be waiting for me. If I stayed inside, I was trapped. I did the only thing I could think of. I hit the horn. The sound blasted through the silence, echoing off the trees. The knocking stopped immediately. I listened, my heart hammering, as whatever was outside moved away, not running, not panicked, just retreating into the woods. I waited. 5 minutes, 10. Then, slowly, I peeked through the blinds. Nothing. The only thing outside was my fire pit, the dying embers still glowing faintly. No footprints, no signs of anyone ever being there. But then I saw something that made my stomach drop. Hanging from a low branch near my RV was a small wooden carving. A figure, human-shaped, with hollowed-out eyes and no mouth. I grabbed my keys, started the engine, and got the hell out of there. I drove straight to the nearest ranger station and told them what happened. They listened, but I could tell they didn't really believe me. One of them even chuckled and said, "Sounds like you met the Whistler." "The what?" I asked. He shook his head. "Just an old legend. Some say it's a lost hiker, others say it's something else. Folks around here hear it from time to time, always at night, always alone." I didn't stay to hear more. I drove out of the park and never looked back. To this day, I still don't know who or what was out there that night. But one thing is for sure. I've always been a sucker for adventure. My partner, Sarah, and I, well, we both share a love for the outdoors. We've done a lot of camping trips, but there's one in particular that I can't forget, no matter how hard I try. It's a trip to the Smoky Mountains that changed everything for us, and to this day we don't talk about it much. It was a year ago, early fall, when the leaves in the Smokies were just starting to turn. Sarah and I had just celebrated our 3rd anniversary, and we decided to go for a long weekend camping trip in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. It had been months since we'd been able to disconnect from work and everything else, so we figured this would be the perfect getaway. We wanted to find a spot that wasn't overly crowded, so we researched some of the more isolated areas of the park. That's when we stumbled upon a small, off-the-grid campground located near the Appalachian Trail. It was deep in the forest, far from the main park roads. The kind of place where you could actually be alone with nature. We were excited. We packed up the RV, grabbed our gear, and headed out. The drive was beautiful, winding through forests and rolling hills, with the crisp mountain air making the windows feel fresh. It took us about 5 hours to get there, and we arrived just as the sun was beginning to set. The place was quiet, almost too quiet. We pulled into the campground and noticed something strange. There were no other campers around. No other RVs, tents, nothing. Just trees, mountains, and silence. I didn't think much of it at the time. After all, it was getting late, and most people would have packed up for the day by now. We found a good spot near a creek, set up our camp, and built a fire. The evening was perfect. The stars were starting to show up, the fire crackled, and we just sat there, enjoying the peace. It felt like the world had slowed down for us. Sarah was sitting across from me, smiling, her hair glowing under the firelight. Everything seemed right. But then, around 9 p.m., something shifted. It started as a faint noise, a whispering, almost like wind through the trees, but it wasn't the wind. I know what wind sounds like, and this was different. The whispers were too deliberate, too rhythmic. I looked at Sarah, and she must have felt it too, because she looked back at me with a concerned expression. "What is that?" she asked softly. I didn't know, but the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up. We both listened in silence for a few minutes, trying to make sense of it. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whispering stopped. We shook it off. Just animals, I told myself. Maybe a group of raccoons or something. But around 11 p.m., when we were getting ready to go to bed, it happened again. Only this time, it was louder. The whispering turned into soft, unintelligible voices. At first, we couldn't tell where it was coming from. It seemed to be coming from all around us, surrounding the campsite. We both froze, listening. I stood up and looked around, but there was nothing in the darkness. Just the trees swaying in the wind. "Do you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "Yeah," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. It was at that moment I realized something else. The forest wasn't as silent as it should have been. No crickets, no night animals. Just silence. I thought about grabbing the flashlight and walking around the campsite, but something stopped me. Something in the pit of my stomach told me that wasn't a good idea. Instead, we went inside the RV and locked the door. I tried to brush it off, telling Sarah it was just our nerves getting the best of us. But neither of us could sleep. The whispering continued, but now it wasn't just voices. It was footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps moving around the RV, circling it. I could hear them crunching on the dry leaves, each footfall getting closer and closer. My heart started racing. I kept my hand on the knife I always carry with me, my eyes darting between the blinds and the dark woods outside. Around 2 a.m., Sarah grabbed my arm. "Listen," she whispered. I strained my ears. The footsteps had stopped. But then I heard something else. Knocking. 3 slow knocks. On the side of the RV, the hairs on my neck stood up. I slowly got up, moving quietly so Sarah wouldn't hear me. I peeked through the blinds, but the darkness was impenetrable. Nothing. No movement, no shadows. The knocking came again. 3 knocks, exactly the same as before. I felt a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. Something wasn't right. "Sarah, we need to leave. Now," I said, my voice hoarse. She looked at me, her face pale. "What do you mean? What's going on?" I didn't answer. Instead, I grabbed the keys and started the RV, trying not to make any noise. The engine roared to life, and I hit the gas, driving as quickly as I could down the narrow, twisting road that led out of the campground. As we drove, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, and that's when I saw it. A shadow, tall and thin, was standing by the side of the road watching us. No movement, no sign of life, just standing there. I didn't stop to see if it was still there, I just drove faster. My hands were gripping the wheel so tight I thought I might break it. We didn't say a word to each other until we reached the nearest town. We pulled into a gas station and I could see the tension in Sarah's face. I could tell she was trying to process what had happened just like I was. "We're not going back," I said firmly. "No," Sarah whispered, "never again." We didn't sleep that night. We spent the next few hours in the gas station just trying to calm down. The next morning, I called the park rangers, thinking maybe they could explain what had happened. They listened to me, but they didn't seem too concerned. They did mention that there were stories about people disappearing around that part of the park, though. People who ventured too deep into the woods and never came back. They said it was all just local legends. But after what we experienced, I'll never be sure of that. I'm telling you this story because after all that's happened, I can't go back to the Smokies. Not ever. I don't know what we encountered out there, but whatever it was something not of this world. And I don't care how many beautiful sunsets or crisp mountain mornings are out there, it's not worth the risk. So, if you ever find yourself in the Smoky Mountains and you come across a secluded campground deep in the woods, take my advice. Turn around and don't look back, because you might not be alone out there. I don't tell this story often because honestly, I still don't know how to explain what happened. Every time I think about it, I get this sick feeling in my stomach, like my body remembers something my mind doesn't want to, but it happened. And if you ever plan on camping alone in the Smoky Mountains, maybe you should hear this first. I had taken my RV up to the Smoky Mountains National Park in North Carolina last October. It was one of those solo trips I like to do when I needed to clear my head. Just me, the mountains, and the open road. I found a small, secluded campground off a narrow road, the kind of place where you could go an entire weekend without seeing another soul. It was late in the season, so most tourists had already gone home, and I had the site all to myself. At least I thought I did. The first day was perfect. The air was crisp, the trees were golden and red, and the only sounds were the distant calls of birds and the occasional rustling of leaves. I spent the afternoon hiking, made a fire at sunset, and by 10 p.m. I was in my RV, ready to sleep. Then the fog rolled in. Around 2 a.m., I woke up suddenly. At first, I didn't know why. The RV was quiet, the air still. Then I heard it. A single, soft knock on the side of the RV, just one. I held my breath, listening. A branch, an animal. But then it happened again. A little louder this time. Knock, knock. Someone was outside. I reached for my phone, but there was no service. Typical. My flashlight was on the small table next to me, so I grabbed it and hesitated for a moment before shining it toward the window. Nothing. I exhaled, forcing myself to relax. Maybe I was just imagining things. Maybe I'd dreamt the knock and woken myself up. I turned off the flashlight, laid back down, and told myself to sleep. But as soon as I closed my eyes, knock, knock, knock. That time, I sat straight up. The knocks weren't coming from the door, but from the far side of the RV near the back window. I grabbed my flashlight again and took a deep breath before peeking out the small window above my bed. At first, I saw nothing but fog. Thick, rolling fog that wrapped around the trees like something alive. My beam barely cut through it, but then I saw him. A man standing just outside the tree line, maybe 30 feet away. He was tall, too thin, wearing old, tattered clothes. But his face, I couldn't see it. The fog distorted it somehow, like his features were shifting, refusing to stay still. I pulled back from the window, my heart hammering in my chest. Who the hell was he? A lost hiker? A local? Something in me knew I shouldn't go outside to check. I stayed completely still, barely breathing, hoping he hadn't seen me. And then, through the silence, I heard it. A whisper. right outside the window. "Let me in." I jumped out of bed, grabbed my car keys, and slid into the driver's seat without even thinking. My hands were shaking so bad I nearly dropped them. I turned the key, praying the RV would start. It did. Headlights flooded the trees. My fingers fumbled for the gear shift, and just as I threw it into drive, something slammed against the side of the RV, hard, like a full-grown man had thrown himself against it. I didn't look. I didn't think. I just floored it. The RV lurched forward, kicking up gravel as I sped down the narrow, winding road. My hands were white-knuckled around the wheel, my whole body trembling. I kept expecting to see him in my mirrors, running after me, keeping pace no matter how fast I went. But I never saw him again. I didn't stop until I hit a gas station nearly an hour away. I pulled into the parking lot, shaking, and sat there for a long time just trying to breathe. Eventually, I forced myself to get out, needing the cold air to clear my head. That's when I saw it. On the side of my RV, just below the bedroom window, was a handprint. Not a normal handprint. The fingers were too long, the shape was all wrong. And the worst part, it was on the inside of the glass. I don't know what I saw that night. A ghost? A demon? Some kind of mountain spirit? I don't know. All I know is that something was out there, and it wanted me to let it in. I've been to a lot of places since then, but I will never, never camp alone in the Smoky Mountains again. I've spent a lot of time camping alone, but after what happened to me at Deep Creek Campground in the Smoky Mountains, I don't think I'll ever do it again. This isn't one of those stories where I can explain everything away with logic. I've tried. I've told myself it was exhaustion, that I imagined things, that the mind plays tricks on you when you're alone in the woods. But deep down, I know better. I know what I saw. It was late September, the perfect time for camping, cool enough to sleep comfortably, warm enough to hike during the day. I'd taken my RV out for a solo trip to Deep Creek Campground, a quiet spot tucked away in the mountains. I'd been there before, but this time it felt different. For one, the campground was almost empty. I saw maybe 2 other RVs parked near the entrance, but the further in I drove, the lonelier it got. I found a perfect spot near the creek and set up my site. By evening, I had a fire going, a cold beer in my hand, and nothing but the sounds of the woods around me. It should have been peaceful, but for some reason, I couldn't shake this weird feeling, like I was being watched. I woke up sometime after midnight to the sound of running water. Not the creek. It was closer, more distinct, like someone walking through the shallow water, slow, deliberate. I sat up in bed, listening. The footsteps would move, then stop, move again. Whoever it was, they weren't just passing by, they were lingering. I grabbed my flashlight and slid to the window, my heart pounding. I hesitated, then pulled back the curtain just enough to peek outside. And there he was, a man, standing in the creek. His back was turned to me, his body deathly still. He was wearing some kind of old-fashioned clothes, looked like a long, tattered coat. Something about the way he stood sent ice through my veins. I watched him, waiting for him to move, to turn, to do anything. He didn't. I must have sat there for 5 minutes, barely breathing, just staring at this guy standing in the water, and then he took a single step, but the splash didn't match the movement. It came a full second before his foot hit the water, like I was hearing the past. I yanked the curtain shut, my hands shaking. I told myself I was tired, that my mind was playing tricks on me, but I couldn't sleep. I just sat there in the dark, waiting for something to happen. The next time I worked up the courage to look outside, the creek was empty. I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I remember was waking up to a sound I will never forget. Knock, knock. It was soft but deliberate, right against the side of my RV. I sat up, my pulse hammering. It was right outside, then I heard it. Not a knock this time. A whisper. Come outside. It was right next to the door. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, as if whoever it was had read my mind, they scraped their fingernails along the metal. Slow, deliberate, like they were letting me know they could wait. I don't know how long I sat there frozen, but eventually the sound stopped. The silence in the woods was overwhelming. Even the crickets had gone quiet. I forced myself to peek outside again. That's when I saw him. He was back in the creek, standing exactly where he had been before, facing away from me. Only this time, there was a second figure, shorter, hunched, standing just a few feet behind the first. I don't know what it was. It wasn't a person. It was wrong. My entire body screamed at me to get out. I didn't waste any time. I jumped into the driver's seat, turned the key, and peeled out of that campground as fast as my RV would go. The whole time, I refused to look in the mirrors. I drove for an hour before I finally stopped at a rest area, heart still racing. When I got out to check the RV, I found something that still haunts me. On the side of my RV, right next to the door, were two sets of muddy footprints. One normal-sized, the other too small, too thin, like a child's, but not human. I don't know what I saw at Deep Creek Campground. I don't know what was knocking on my RV or what was standing in that creek. All I know is that I will never camp alone in the Smoky Mountains again. And if you do, don't open the door. I swear I'll never go back to the Smoky Mountains. Not after what happened that night. It was last fall when I decided to take my RV out for a solo camping trip. My name is Jake, just a regular guy who loves the outdoors, photography, and the peace that comes with being out in nature. I had been to the Smokies a few times before, but this time I wanted to find a more secluded spot. I picked a campground near Deep Creek, not too far from Bryson City, North Carolina. The place wasn't too crowded, and the crisp autumn air made it perfect for camping. The first day was peaceful. I set up camp, took some photos of the scenery, and even hiked a short trail before heading back. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, I built a small fire, cooked some dinner, and sat back to enjoy the quiet. The only sounds were the crackling fire, the occasional hoot of an owl, and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. It was perfect, until it wasn't. Sometime around midnight, I woke up to something scratching against my RV. It was faint at first, just a light scraping sound. I sat up, heart pounding, listening closely. Could be a raccoon or some other animal, I told myself. But then came the tapping, rhythmic, slow, like someone, something, was deliberately trying to get my attention. I turned on the outside lights but saw nothing, just trees swaying in the wind. I shook it off, convinced it was my imagination, and went back to bed. Then, at exactly 3:12 a.m., I heard it again. This time, it was coming from the other side of the RV near the door. I grabbed my flashlight, my breath shaky, and peered out the window. What I saw made my stomach drop. There were footprints in the dirt, bare footprints, and they led right up to my door. I didn't hear anyone walking away, no rustling in the bushes, no sound at all, just those footprints stopping inches from where I slept. I stayed up the rest of the night, gripping the small hunting knife I always keep in the RV. Every few minutes, I'd hear something, branches snapping, distant whispers carried by the wind, and the unmistakable feeling that I was being watched. But no matter how much I looked, I saw nothing. As soon as the sky turned gray with the first light of dawn, I packed up. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just threw everything into the RV and got out of there. The weirdest part? When I stopped at a gas station outside of town, an old man sitting on the porch saw my RV and waved me over. "Camping up in the park?" he asked. I nodded, still shaken. "Let me guess," he said, squinting at me. "You heard the scratches, the tapping?" I felt my stomach twist. He just sighed and shook his head. "You're lucky, boy. Some don't make it out of there." I didn't ask any more questions. I just got in my RV and drove. And I swear to you, I'm never going back to the Smoky Mountains again. I had always dreamed of capturing the wild beauty of the Smoky Mountains, so when the opportunity arose to spend a weekend there, I jumped at the chance. My name's Alex, and I'm a nature photographer, always chasing the perfect shot. The kind of shot that makes people stop and stare. I had spent months planning the trip, mapping out the most remote locations in the park, the spots where few people venture, hoping to find something that would take my work to the next level. But what I found in those mountains, what I captured in that last shot, changed my life forever. I arrived in the Smokies on a cool Thursday afternoon, and after a long drive, I set up camp at a secluded spot near the edge of a dense forest. The place was eerily quiet, except for the occasional rustling of the wind through the trees and the distant sound of a creek. No one else seemed to be around, and I liked it that way. Just me, my camera, and the mountains. After a couple of hours of setting up my gear and getting everything organized, I decided to start the shoot. I had been eyeing a particular spot, a clearing near the forest edge with a perfect view of the mountain ridges. The light was just right, with golden hues filtering through the trees as the sun began to dip below the horizon. I thought it would make the perfect landscape shot. I set up my tripod, adjusted the settings on my camera, and began snapping photos. The colors were incredible. The mountains were alive with light, the trees in the foreground casting long, dramatic shadows. As the sun set and twilight settled in, I couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. There's something about the solitude of nature that pulls you in, makes you feel small, yet connected to the earth. But as I was adjusting my lens for one last shot, I saw something. At first, it was just a movement, something caught in the corner of my eye. It was faint, almost imperceptible. I turned my head to the side, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the trees. I blinked, convinced my eyes were playing tricks on me. But no, the figure was still there. It was tall, wearing a long coat that blended into the shadows of the forest. The person didn't move. They were just standing there, staring at me, though I couldn't see their face. For a moment, I thought it might be another hiker, maybe a ranger. But the longer I stared, the more I realized something wasn't right. No one else had been around when I set up camp, and this person wasn't making any noise. The wind was picking up, but this figure stood completely still, as if unaffected by the elements. I called out, "Hey, are you all right?" There was no response. I took a step forward, hoping to get a better look, but the figure didn't budge. Something about the stillness unnerved me. I snapped a quick photo, just in case it was someone in need of help, and started walking toward them. As I got closer, I saw that their coat was old, tattered even, as if it had been through years of wear. I hesitated. Something told me not to get any closer. I stopped, about 20 feet away from the figure. "Hey!" I called again, a little louder. Still, no response. I looked around for any signs of life, any other hikers or campers, but the area was completely silent. I was alone, except for the figure in front of me. I decided to back off slowly, thinking I might just be overreacting. Maybe it was an abandoned mannequin or some weird optical illusion. But as I turned to leave, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A voice. It wasn't loud, but it was clear enough. The voice whispered, almost too softly to hear, "You shouldn't be here." I froze. The voice was deep, almost guttural, and it felt like it was coming from all directions at once. I whipped around, but the figure was gone. In the span of a second, they had vanished into the trees, leaving no trace behind. I stood there for a moment, my heart racing, wondering if I had imagined the whole thing. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing up. The silence around me felt oppressive now, almost suffocating. I didn't want to be in the woods anymore. I grabbed my gear and rushed back to my campsite, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled over me. The photo I had taken of the figure was still on my camera, but when I checked it, the image was completely distorted. The figure, whatever it was blurred, as if something was blocking the lens. I didn't sleep that night. The sounds of the forest seemed louder than usual, every twig snapping outside the RV making me jump. My mind raced with questions. What had I seen? Who or what had been out there? The next morning, I decided to leave early. I packed up my gear, eager to get out of the park and put as much distance between me and whatever I had encountered. But just before I left, I decided to check the photographs from the previous night. I scrolled through the shots, each one capturing the beauty of the mountains, the light, the shadows. But when I reached the last photo, the one I had taken of the figure, it wasn't a photograph of the clearing. It was something else. The shot was blurry, but I could make out two dark, hollow shapes in the center, eyes. They were staring directly at the camera. There was no face, no body, just eyes, dark and empty. I deleted the photo immediately, but the feeling of being watched never left me. It was like the figure had marked me and it wasn't going to let go. I didn't return to the Smoky Mountains for months. The memory of that figure, those hollow eyes, haunted me. It took me a long time to convince myself that it was just an odd experience. Maybe a trick of the light, or my mind playing tricks on me after hours of hiking and photography. But every time I look at my work now, every time I review my shots, there's always that lingering feeling that maybe, just maybe, there's something out there. Something I caught in my camera's lens that I wasn't meant to see. I don't know what I photographed that night, but I know this. If you're ever in the Smoky Mountains, alone, in the dark, and you feel like someone's watching you, trust your instincts. Because it might not be a hiker or a ranger or even a trick of the light. It might just be something else. Something that you don't want to capture in your lens. Trust me, you won't be the same after. I'll never forget that trip. It was supposed to be just another weekend adventure with my two best friends, John and Chris. We'd been hiking, camping, and exploring the outdoors together for years. The Smoky Mountains were next on our list, and we couldn't have been more excited. But that trip, well, it became the one adventure we'd all wish we could forget. It started like any other trip. We packed up the car with all the gear we'd need for a weekend in the wilderness. Tents, sleeping bags, food, water, and of course, our cameras. We were all amateur photographers, hoping to capture some of the natural beauty the Smokies had to offer. The plan was to hike one of the more challenging trails in the park, a trail known for its breathtaking views of the mountains and waterfalls. It was a long, hard hike, but we'd all done tougher ones before. Nothing could go wrong. We arrived at the trailhead just as the sun was rising, the first light of day casting a golden glow over the forest. The air was crisp, and there was a peaceful quiet that enveloped us as we laced up our boots and started walking. The trail was rugged, with steep inclines and rocky paths, but it was exactly what we had been hoping for. Every few minutes, we'd stop to snap photos of the sun filtering through the trees or a bird soaring above. We were deep in the forest when we noticed something strange. At first, it was subtle. A shift in the air, almost like the atmosphere had changed. The wind had died down, and the forest felt unusually still. Normally, the woods are alive with the sounds of nature, but there was nothing. Just silence. We brushed it off as nothing more than our nerves getting the best of us. After all, we were hundreds of miles from civilization, deep in the heart of the mountains. It was easy to get spooked. But then, as we hiked further, things started to feel wrong. The trail, which had been well marked earlier, seemed to become less defined. The markers were spaced farther apart, and we started to notice that the trees around us were different, strange, twisted shapes that seemed to lean in toward the path, as if they were closing us in. The feeling of being watched crept up on us. "We're probably just off the beaten path," John said, trying to sound confident. He was the most experienced hiker of the three of us, always the first to suggest we push on when things got tough. But even he looked uneasy. I remember Chris stopping in his tracks, staring at a point ahead of us. "Do you hear that?" he asked. We all fell silent. For a moment there was nothing. Then faintly we heard something. A sound that wasn't quite natural. It was a rhythmic tapping, almost like a drumbeat coming from deeper in the forest. "It's probably just an animal," I said, though my voice lacked the conviction I was trying to put into it. But none of us were convinced. The tapping wasn't like anything we'd heard before. It didn't sound like the usual forest noises. This was too deliberate, too purposeful. We continued on, but the atmosphere only grew more oppressive. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the trail, and the forest felt denser, darker. I don't know how to explain it, but it felt like the trees were closing in on us, making the air heavy and suffocating. Then came the first strange thing. We were following the trail when we stumbled upon a small clearing. There, in the middle of the clearing, was an old wooden structure. It wasn't a house, not really. It was more like a small, abandoned shack. The wood was weathered and rotting, but what struck me was the way it seemed so out of place in the middle of nowhere. There were no signs of people nearby, no signs of human activity. Just this shack, sitting in the middle of a forgotten clearing. "Let's check it out," John suggested, ever the curious one. I didn't want to, but curiosity got the better of me. We approached the shack, and as we got closer, we noticed something even stranger. There were symbols carved into the wood. They weren't just random marks, they were deliberate, almost like some kind of ritualistic writing. I shuddered at the thought. We stood outside for a few moments just looking at the shack before Chris spoke up. "We should go," he said quietly. "This doesn't feel right." But John was already inside, pushing open the door with a loud creak. We followed him in reluctantly. The inside was dark, musty, and smelled of decay. The floorboards creaked beneath our feet as we moved cautiously, our flashlights flickering in the dim light. There was nothing of particular note inside, just piles of rotting wood and debris. But there was something unsettling about the place. It felt like it had been abandoned for a long time, but still, there was a sense of presence there, a feeling that we weren't supposed to be there. John seemed unfazed, but I could see the look in Chris's eyes. He was ready to leave. "We need to get out of here," Chris urged. We didn't argue. We turned and left the shack quickly. But as we made our way back to the trail, the air seemed to change again. The silence was overwhelming, and the tapping sound we'd heard earlier had returned, louder this time. We all stopped, looking around. "I'm not imagining that, right?" John asked. "No," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I hear it too." The tapping was coming from all around us now, echoing through the trees in a rhythmic pattern. It was like someone, or something, was following us. We didn't know what to do. We were far from the trailhead, and we couldn't see anything in the darkening forest. The feeling of being watched intensified. Every time we looked behind us, we saw nothing, but it was like there was something just out of sight. We decided to make our way back to the main trail, hoping to get some distance between us and whatever was out there. But the further we went, the more the forest seemed to shift. The path became less recognizable, the trees more twisted. We were lost. "I don't think this is the right trail," I said, panic starting to set in. Chris pulled out his phone to check the map, but there was no signal. We were completely cut off. The tapping grew louder, now mixed with soft whispers, like voices carried on the wind. The air was thick with tension, and I could feel the weight of it pressing down on us. We tried to retrace our steps, but every time we thought we were heading in the right direction, the forest seemed to shift. And then it happened. As we stumbled through the underbrush, John froze in place, staring ahead with wide eyes. We followed his gaze, and there, in the distance, was something that shouldn't have been there. A trail marker. But it was different from the others we had seen. This one was old, faded, and had a symbol carved into it. The same symbol we'd seen on the shack. "We need to get out of here now," John said, his voice shaky. But it was too late. The forest was alive now, the whispers louder, the tapping constant. The path seemed to close in on us, the trees leaning in as though they were trapping us in. We ran. We ran as fast as we could, not knowing where we were going, just desperate to get out of the woods. After what felt like hours of running, we finally saw the lights of the trailhead in the distance. We burst out of the forest, gasping for air, our hearts racing. But as we turned to look back, there was nothing. The forest was silent again, as if it had never been alive at all. We didn't speak much that night. We packed up and left the Smoky Mountains the next morning, not even bothering to finish the trail we had planned to complete. To this day, none of us talk about what happened in the woods. We don't mention the tapping, the whispers, or the shack. But we all know something is out there, and whatever it was, it didn't want us there. If you're ever in the Smokies and you feel like something's off, trust your instincts. Because sometimes the forest is hiding more than just wildlife. Sometimes it's hiding something you're better off never finding. I can still hear the whistle. It's been months since that weekend in the Smoky Mountains, but the sound still haunts me. I wasn't alone, of course. I had my dog, Luna, with me. We were supposed to be enjoying a peaceful camping trip in the mountains. Just me and my loyal pup. A break from the noise and chaos of city life. But what happened that weekend? Well, it's not something I'll ever forget. It all started on a Friday morning. I had been planning the trip for weeks, hoping to escape the pressures of work and just spend some quiet time in nature. I packed up the car, grabbed Luna's favorite leash and blanket, and we made our way to the Smokies. It wasn't our first camping trip, but it was definitely going to be one of the most memorable, for all the wrong reasons. We arrived at the park around noon. The weather was perfect. Clear skies, crisp air, and the smell of pine trees filling my lungs. Luna, my German shepherd, was excited, her tail wagging as she jumped out of the car, ready to explore the wilderness. We found a nice spot near a small creek, far enough from the crowds, and set up camp. The sound of running water made the setting feel magical, and Luna loved it, running around with her usual energy. That evening, as the sun began to set, we sat by the fire. The warmth from the flames was a welcome comfort as the temperature dropped. I had a small notebook with me, jotting down some thoughts while Luna lay by my feet, content. It was peaceful, serene, and for a moment, I felt like I was finally able to breathe. But then, just as the darkness settled in, something strange happened. Luna's ears perked up. She sat up from her spot, her body stiff, her head tilted slightly to one side. I knew that look. It was the one she always gave when she heard something odd, something out of the ordinary. I didn't think much of it at first. We were in the woods, after all. There are always strange sounds, branches creaking, animals moving around. But then I heard it. A soft whistle. It was faint at first, just a barely audible sound, like a breeze carrying a distant tune. But as I listened, the whistle grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't the kind of whistle you'd expect from nature. It wasn't the chirping of birds or the rustle of leaves. No, this was different. It was a human whistle, a low and melodic sound, as if someone was standing just beyond the trees, waiting for something. Luna started growling, low and deep in her chest, her hackles raised. She wasn't acting like herself. Usually, she was calm and friendly with everyone. But this was something else. I called her to me, but she refused to move. She was frozen in place, staring into the woods, her eyes wide and alert. I grabbed the flashlight and turned it toward the trees. The whistle stopped. I sat there in stunned silence, heart racing. Maybe it was just another camper, I thought. Maybe someone was out there, playing around, whistling for fun. But something told me that wasn't the case. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease that was creeping over me. It was just the woods, I told myself. It's always a little creepy when you're out here alone, even with your dog. But Luna wouldn't stop staring into the darkness. Then it happened again. This time, the whistle was louder, clearer, and much closer. I jumped to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest. Luna growled even louder now, her body tense, her fur standing on end. I pointed the flashlight toward the sound, but there was nothing. No figure, no movement. Just the shadowy trees swaying in the wind. I felt my breath catch in my throat. Something was wrong. The whistle continued, but now it was accompanied by a strange rustling sound, like something or someone was moving through the underbrush. I grabbed Luna's leash, tugging her gently toward the tent. We had to go. I didn't know why, but every part of me screamed that we weren't safe. We hurried into the tent and zipped it shut. My hands were shaking as I tried to calm Luna, who was now whimpering softly, her tail tucked between her legs. The whistle came again, louder this time, and then it stopped. The forest fell into an eerie silence. I lay awake for hours, listening. Every crack of a branch, every distant sound had me jumping, my eyes darting around the dark corners of the tent. Luna eventually calmed down, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Morning came, but the feeling of dread lingered. I debated packing up and heading home early, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. I figured I'd let my imagination get the best of me. After all, Luna was calm now, and the whistle hadn't returned. Maybe it had been nothing. I decided to take a walk with Luna to clear my head. We ventured deeper into the woods, following the creek, hoping the fresh air would settle my nerves. But the deeper we went, the more unsettled I became. The trees were thicker, the light dimmer, and the sounds of the forest felt off. I noticed that there were no birds, no squirrels, no chipmunks. It was as if all the life had vanished. We came across an old, overgrown trail, one that looked like it hadn't been used in years. It seemed to go on forever, winding around rocks and large trees. Despite the unease that crept up on me, I decided to follow it. Luna was still by my side, but she kept looking over her shoulder, her eyes darting around nervously. And then, just as we reached a small clearing, I heard it again. The whistle. This time, it wasn't just a whistle. There was a low hum beneath it like a chant, as if the sound was coming from a distant place, or maybe something not human. I froze. Luna's fur stood on end, and she let out a low growl, her body trembling with fear. I turned to leave, but Luna pulled back, refusing to budge. She was staring intently at something I couldn't see. My pulse quickened as I realized something wasn't right. There was something ahead of us, just beyond the trees. I couldn't make it out, but I could feel it. Something was watching us. The whistle came again, louder now, and I felt the air grow colder. I grabbed Luna's leash and tugged at her, trying to pull her away, but she wouldn't move. It was as if she was frozen in place, her body rigid with fear. Then, in the distance, I saw it. A figure standing in the trees. It was a person, but their features were too blurry, their form too distorted to make out. It stood motionless, just watching us. I couldn't see its face, but the feeling it gave me was one of pure terror. I pulled Luna as hard as I could, and finally she snapped out of it, running toward the trailhead. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I just needed to get out of there. We reached the campsite, packed up quickly, and left the Smoky Mountains without another thought. I didn't stay another night, not even for a second. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw someone standing at the edge of the trees, watching us leave. I still don't know what happened that night. Who, or what, was out there whistling in the woods. But I do know one thing. The Smoky Mountains are beautiful, but they hold secrets. Secrets that are best left undisturbed. I haven't been back since, and Luna, she still gets nervous whenever we go near the woods. It was a summer I'll never forget. My name is Ossiton, and I'd always heard about the beauty and serenity of the Smoky Mountains National Park in North Carolina. I decided to take my RV out there, hoping for a peaceful camping trip surrounded by nature. I wasn't prepared for what I would encounter. I arrived at the park late in the afternoon, ready to set up camp in one of the more secluded areas. The drive there was long, but the view was breathtaking. Tall trees, mist rising from the valleys, and the distant sound of running streams. It was everything you expect from a perfect outdoor escape. After I parked my RV, I set up my campsite near a quiet clearing. The sun was starting to dip behind the mountains, casting a golden hue over the area. I made a fire, cooked some dinner, and thought to myself how lucky I was to be so far away from the city's chaos. As night fell, the temperature dropped, and the peacefulness of the mountains was only disturbed by the occasional rustling of leaves. But as I sat in front of my fire, something felt off. It was hard to pinpoint, but it was like an unease in the air, something that made me look over my shoulder more than once. Around 10 p.m., just as I was about to head inside to sleep, I heard what sounded like footsteps in the woods. It was too steady to be an animal and too loud to be the wind. My heart started racing. I tried to convince myself it was just a deer or some other forest creature, but deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I stayed in my RV that night, the door locked, the curtains drawn. The sounds outside didn't stop. It felt like someone, or something, was walking around my campsite, getting closer, then backing off, only to come back again. Every so often, I'd hear a twig snap, and I'd jump in my seat, wide-eyed and awake, until I'd finally fall into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, I woke up with a strange feeling in my gut. When I stepped outside, my campsite looked different. The fire pit was disturbed, like someone had been tampering with it. The logs had been moved around, and there were footprints near my RV. But they weren't human footprints, at least not from any person I knew. The size was all wrong. They looked like something big, maybe a bear, but there was something unsettling about the way they were arranged. It wasn't random. I decided to pack up and leave right away. As I was hitching up my RV, I noticed something even more disturbing, something that almost made me freeze in my tracks. There were claw marks on the side of my RV, big, jagged, and deep. It was like something had tried to claw its way inside. But I didn't hear anything at all during the night, and I had been wide awake listening for any disturbance. I left the park, not bothering to ask anyone else if they'd heard anything strange or experienced something similar. I didn't want to seem paranoid, but part of me was convinced that something, or someone, was out there in the woods. Something that had been watching me. Since then, I've never gone back to the Smoky Mountains. People tell me it's just wildlife, but I know what I felt that night. It wasn't just the quiet of the forest. It was the feeling of being watched, the unexplainable sounds, and those marks on my RV that I still can't make sense of. That night, I learned that some things are better left unexplored. So, I won't be going back. Never again. My name is Lucas, and I never believed in the paranormal. I was a man of logic, reason, and a deep appreciation for nature. I'd been camping for years, from the Grand Canyon to Yosemite, but nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered in the Smoky Mountains National Park. It's a story I still can't quite explain, and one I wish I could forget. It was the fall of 2022, and I had decided to take my RV on a solo trip to the Smoky Mountains. The weather was cool but not cold, the perfect time to explore the park without the summer crowds. I'd read a lot about the park's history, how it was one of the most biodiverse places in the U.S., with its mist-covered peaks and thick forests. I wanted to get away from the hustle of the city and have a few quiet days to myself. I arrived in the late afternoon, just as the golden hour bathed the mountains in a warm, inviting glow. The air was crisp, and the sounds of wildlife were all around. I parked my RV in one of the more remote campgrounds, away from the main areas. I'd been warned about the bears, but it was nothing I hadn't dealt with before. I wasn't worried. Setting up my campsite, I felt a strange sense of peace. There was something calming about the towering trees around me, their leaves rustling softly in the breeze. As evening approached, I made myself dinner and sat outside with a book, the crackling fire beside me. It was quiet, almost too quiet, and the deeper into the forest I got, the more I realized I hadn't seen another soul since entering the park. Around 9 p.m., I decided to turn in for the night. I locked the RV doors, drew the curtains, and tried to get some sleep. But the forest outside had other plans. At around midnight, I was woken up by an eerie noise. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't even the wind. It was like whispering voices. Soft, unintelligible whispers that seemed to come from all around me. I brushed it off at first, thinking it was just the wind through the trees, or perhaps my imagination playing tricks. But then it got louder. The whispers became distinct, like people talking just outside my RV in the forest, but too far to make out any words. I sat up in bed, straining my ears. It wasn't right. It sounded like multiple voices, and they were too close for comfort. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, but deep down, I knew something wasn't normal. I turned on my flashlight and checked the locks on the RV doors, but everything seemed fine. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there. I decided to call it a night and try to sleep through it, but the whispers kept going, growing in intensity like a chorus of voices surrounding me. Every few minutes I'd hear a distinct sound, like footsteps on the forest floor. Then there was a tapping, soft at first, but it soon grew louder, like someone knocking on the RV windows. I was frozen. I didn't know what to do. I grabbed my phone and checked the time. 3 a.m. The tapping stopped abruptly. The voices were gone, but I couldn't bring myself to sleep. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening for any other sounds, but the only thing I heard was the occasional rustle of leaves. It was like whatever had been there was now watching me, waiting. The next morning, I stepped outside, my body stiff from the sleepless night. I couldn't tell if I was more exhausted from fear or the restless sleep I had forced myself to endure. The campgrounds were eerily quiet, not a single other camper in sight. The morning fog hung in the air like a shroud, and the trees seemed to loom over me, almost watching. I decided to head out and explore the trails, hoping to shake off the odd experience from the night before. But as I hiked deeper into the woods, the unease began to creep back in. The silence was unnatural. The further I went, the more I felt like I was being followed, even though there was no one in sight. It was like the forest had a pulse, and it was alive with something I couldn't see. By midday, I was getting frustrated and decided to pack up and leave. But as I returned to my RV, I noticed something that stopped me in my tracks. There were fresh, deep scratches on the side of the vehicle. Scratches that weren't there when I had left earlier. They were long, jagged marks, like claws. I was sure I had locked all the doors and windows before leaving, but the back door was now slightly ajar. I was too scared to check inside. I quickly hooked up my RV to the truck and drove away, not even bothering to check out the rest of the park. As I passed through the entrance, I noticed a park ranger sitting in his vehicle. I rolled down my window, half expecting him to stop me. I was ready to explain what had happened, but when I asked if there had been any reports of strange occurrences, he just gave me a tired look. "Just another night in the mountains," he said, his voice flat. "You get used to it." That didn't make me feel any better. I drove home, the whole time feeling like something was still watching me, trailing me in the rearview mirror. When I finally made it back, I parked the RV and checked the scratches on the side again. They were still there, as if they had been left by something that knew I was never supposed to come back. I haven't been back to the Smoky Mountains since that trip, and I have no plans to return. I don't know what happened out there, but I've heard rumors about the park being haunted, about the old folklore surrounding the mountains. Some say the spirits of those who died in the forests still roam the woods. Others believe the land itself has a life of its own, watching and waiting for the right moment to draw you in. I don't know what I encountered that night, but I'm not willing to test it again. So, I'll leave the Smoky Mountains to those who don't mind walking into the unknown. For me, I learned my lesson the hard way. Never again. We were just a regular couple, Amanda and Derek, living busy lives and constantly dreaming about escaping the daily grind. One fall weekend, we decided to take our RV out to the Smoky Mountains National Park in North Carolina. We'd been camping before, but this would be our first time in the Smokies. The idea of spending a couple of nights immersed in nature, away from the noise and stress of city life, seemed like the perfect way to reconnect. It was a Friday afternoon when we arrived, the sun hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor. We parked our RV in one of the more secluded campsites, tucked away from the main roads. The site had a stunning view of the valley below, surrounded by dense trees that seemed to stretch on forever. We were thrilled. The air was crisp, and the leaves were beginning to turn those deep reds and golds, signaling the peak of autumn. We set up camp, built a fire, and cooked dinner together. The smell of roasted marshmallows and the crackle of the fire filled the air, and for a while, everything felt perfect. We talked and laughed, watching the stars emerge one by one as the darkness enveloped us. It was peaceful, almost surreal in its tranquility. As night settled in, we retreated to the RV, ready to get some rest. But as soon as we closed the door behind us, something strange happened. The sounds of the forest outside seemed to change. The usual chorus of crickets and night animals faded into an eerie silence. It felt wrong. I noticed Amanda was unnerved, glancing nervously toward the windows. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice tense. I didn't hear anything at first, so I brushed it off. "It's just the wind," I said, trying to calm her. But then, just as I was about to lay down, we heard it. A soft knocking sound coming from the side of the RV. Tap, 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 almost rhythmic, like someone was gently knocking on the door. "Who the hell would be out there?" I asked, getting up to check. There was no one there. The night outside was as still as ever, the trees casting long shadows under the dim light of the moon. I checked the locks and everything seemed fine, but Amanda was visibly shaken, her eyes wide with worry. "I don't like this," she said, her voice trembling. "Let's just leave. We can go to a hotel or something." But we both knew that wasn't the kind of thing you do after driving hours to get to such a beautiful place. So, I convinced her to stay, hoping that it was just our imaginations getting the best of us. We went to bed, but neither of us could sleep. The air inside the RV felt thick, heavy with tension. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel something watching us. Every creak of the RV, every whisper of the wind against the trees made me jump. Around 3 a.m., we were both wide awake when we heard something else. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving around the RV. They circled us, coming closer and then moving away, as if someone was walking in a pattern, making sure we knew they were there. Amanda gripped my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Someone's outside," she whispered, her voice a mix of fear and disbelief. I wanted to check outside, but something told me not to. I felt like if I opened that door, whatever was out there might come in. The footsteps continued for what felt like an eternity, then stopped abruptly. A tense silence followed. We waited, barely breathing. That's when we heard the whispering. It started low at first, like voices carried on the wind, but then it grew louder, distinct, and more urgent. It sounded like multiple people speaking at once, but we couldn't make out any words. It was as though the voices were right outside the RV, almost like they were trying to communicate with us, begging us to listen. We both froze in terror, the hair on the back of our necks standing up. Suddenly, the whispering stopped, and we both heard a deep, guttural growl. It came from the woods. It wasn't an animal. It was something darker, something unnatural. The growl lingered in the air, echoing through the trees before it disappeared. That was it. We couldn't stay another minute. I jumped up, grabbed the keys, and started the RV, even though I was half-conscious with fear. Amanda was already in the passenger seat, trembling. As I started to drive out of the campground, I looked back through the rearview mirror. For just a moment, I swear I saw someone standing in the clearing near our site, an outline of a person. But the figure was strange, distorted, like it was moving in ways that didn't make sense. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. We didn't speak much on the drive back to civilization. We just wanted to get as far away from that place as possible. But the silence between us was thick, heavy with the realization that something was wrong. Something was very wrong with that campground. The next day, I reached out to a friend who'd been to the Smoky Mountains before. I told him about the strange sounds and what we'd experienced. His response chilled me to the bone. "You're not the first to experience something like that in those woods," he said. "There are legends about people hearing whispers, seeing figures, and feeling like they're being watched. Some people say the park is haunted by the spirits of those who disappeared in the mountains years ago, people who were never found." I couldn't believe what I was hearing, but I couldn't deny what had happened either. The growl, the whispers, the feeling of being watched. It all fit the stories he told me. We never went back to the Smoky Mountains. I don't know if what we experienced was paranormal or just our minds playing tricks, but I do know one thing. Something was out there, and we weren't welcome. I still get chills thinking about it. And Amanda? She hasn't gone camping since. Never again. My name is Thomas, and this is the story I'll never forget. It happened back in the summer of 2021, when my son, Jake, and I decided to take a trip to the Smoky Mountains National Park. It was meant to be a bonding trip, just the two of us, away from the noise and distractions of our daily lives. We had been planning this for months, and I could tell Jake was excited. He was growing up fast, and I wanted to make sure we made some good memories together. We arrived at the park on a Friday afternoon, the sun still high in the sky, casting long shadows across the mountain trails. The campground we chose was nestled in a quiet corner of the park, far from the popular spots. It was a place I had visited before, a spot I had always found peaceful. The forest surrounding us was dense, the trees towering above like sentinels watching over the land. Jake was thrilled to be there, and we spent the afternoon setting up the RV, gathering firewood, and preparing a campfire. It was the perfect beginning to what should have been a perfect weekend. As night fell, the forest around us grew still, almost unnaturally so. The sounds of wildlife, which had been abundant earlier, seemed to fade. All we could hear were the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves. It was a peaceful stillness, but something about it felt off. Too quiet, too empty. But I didn't let it bother me. I wanted Jake to have a good time, and I didn't want him to sense any unease from me. We sat by the fire, roasting marshmallows and talking about the old days when I used to take him camping as a kid. He loved hearing those stories. But as the fire burned low, Jake grew restless. He kept glancing toward the woods, his eyes narrowing as if he were trying to make something out in the darkness. "Dad, do you see that?" Jake asked, pointing toward the tree line. I squinted into the dark, but all I could see was the dense forest stretching out before us, shrouded in shadows. "See what, buddy?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Jake didn't answer right away. He just stared at the trees, his hand still pointing in the direction of the woods. I felt a chill run down my spine. It's probably just some animals moving around. There's nothing to worry about. But Jake wasn't convinced. He continued to stare into the darkness, his face scrunching in confusion. I saw someone standing there. I didn't want to frighten him, so I laughed it off. "It's probably just a shadow or something, Jake. There's no one out there. You're just imagining things." But deep down, I felt a knot in my stomach. Something about the woods felt wrong. Too still, too silent. I had camped in the Smokies before, but I had never felt this uneasy. We decided to turn in for the night. I locked the RV doors and pulled the curtains shut. But sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the forest outside, the wind in the trees, the occasional snap of a twig. But there was something else too, something I couldn't place. It was a feeling, an overwhelming sense of being watched. At around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by a noise, a soft thump, followed by a faint scratching sound. like something dragging across the ground. I sat up, my heart racing. The RV was silent again, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I glanced over at Jake, who was fast asleep, his face peaceful. But the noises outside continued, growing closer. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just an animal, maybe a bear or a raccoon. But then I heard it, a voice. Soft and low, barely a whisper, but unmistakable. "Help me." It came from just outside the RV, close enough that I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My heart pounded in my chest. I could hear the voice again, this time more desperate. "Help me, please." I froze. It was unmistakable. Someone in distress was out there, right next to us. I grabbed my flashlight and silently moved to the door, trying not to wake Jake. My mind raced with questions. Was someone hurt? Had someone gotten lost in the woods? I slowly unlatched the door and stepped outside, scanning the dark forest with the beam of my flashlight. The silence was deafening. There was no one in sight. "Hello?" I called into the night, my voice shaking. "Is someone out there?" The only response was the soft rustle of leaves, as if the trees themselves were whispering back to me. I took a step forward, still shining the flashlight around, but there was nothing. No sign of life, nothing that could explain the voice. I turned back toward the RV, and that's when I saw it. Standing at the edge of the trees was a figure, barely visible in the shadows, watching us. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and I couldn't make out any details, just the silhouette of a person, standing perfectly still, facing me. I froze in place, my breath caught in my throat. I knew, without a doubt, that whatever it wasn't human. The figure didn't move. It didn't make a sound. It just stood there staring. I quickly ran back to the RV, slammed the door shut and locked it. I checked on Jake again. He was still asleep, oblivious to the terror that had just unfolded outside. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, too terrified to sleep. The figure never moved, never came closer, but I could feel its presence outside, as if it was waiting for something. At dawn, I packed up the RV in a hurry. I didn't even bother to cook breakfast. The sense of dread still clung to me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As I drove away from the campsite, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the figure again, standing at the edge of the woods, watching us leave. We never spoke of it again, not to anyone, not even to Jake. But I knew that whatever we had seen out there in the Smokies, it wasn't something that could be explained. We didn't stay for another night. We didn't even look for another campsite. I took the long way home just to avoid going back to that park. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that we were being watched, not by a person, but by something much older, much darker. And I know one thing for sure. I'll never return to the Smoky Mountains. Never again. My name is Rachel, and this is the story of the weekend that changed my life forever. I still can't sleep without thinking about it, and I still wake up in cold sweats hearing whispers in the dark. It was supposed to be a fun girls' getaway, just me, my best friend Melissa, and our two other close friends Jenny and Brooke. We'd been planning it for weeks. A weekend trip to the Smoky Mountains National Park. Camping in my family's old RV, hiking, roasting marshmallows, and just enjoying a break from city life. We arrived on a Friday afternoon, the drive up filled with laughter, music, and inside jokes. The campground was secluded, just how we wanted it. No crowds, no noise, just us and the beauty of nature. We set up our spot, gathered some firewood, and by sunset we were sitting around the campfire, sipping wine and talking about life. The air was crisp, the stars above us were dazzling, and for a while it felt perfect. until the first strange thing happened. Melissa, who had been laughing just a moment ago, suddenly stopped mid-sentence and tilted her head. "Did you hear that?" she asked. We all fell silent, listening. The woods around us were quiet, too quiet. No crickets, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just an eerie stillness that made my skin crawl. "Probably just an animal," Jenny said, tossing another log onto the fire. But Melissa wasn't convinced. "I swear I heard something, like footsteps," she muttered. I brushed it off. "We're in the middle of the woods, Mel. Of course, you'll hear weird noises." Still, the uneasy feeling settled over all of us, and the laughter didn't come as easily after that. That night, we turned in early. The RV was cozy, but the wind outside was picking up, rattling the windows. I was in one of the bunks, scrolling through my phone, when Brooke whispered, "Rachel, are you awake?" "Yeah," I replied, turning my head toward her. She hesitated before saying, "I swear I saw something outside, just standing there." I sat up, my heart starting to pound. "What do you mean?" She pulled her blanket tighter around herself. "I woke up a few minutes ago and looked out the window. I saw a shadow, like a person, but really tall. It was just standing between the trees." A chill ran down my spine. Maybe it was a tree? It moved. That was enough for me. I climbed out of my bunk and peeked out the window, shining my phone's flashlight toward the woods. Nothing. Just trees swaying in the wind. I was about to tell her she was imagining things when something happened that made my blood run cold. A soft tapping on the window, 3 slow taps, my breath caught in my throat. Brooke's eyes widened in horror. We were frozen, unable to move. Then, from the bunk behind us, Melissa's sleepy voice mumbled, "Who's knocking?" We didn't answer. We didn't breathe. I reached out and pulled the curtain shut, trying to convince myself it was just the wind. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next morning, none of us spoke much about the night before. Melissa and Jenny were confused when Brooke and I insisted on packing up and leaving early, but I could tell they felt something was off too. We stepped outside, and that's when we saw them. Footprints. Large, human-like footprints leading around the RV, not animal tracks, not something explainable. And the worst part? They started from the edge of the woods, but they never led back. Something, or someone, had walked up to our RV, circled it, and then disappeared. I still get chills thinking about it. Whatever it was, it had been standing there watching us long enough to leave those prints. We left that morning, cutting our trip short. We never spoke about it again. But sometimes when I close my eyes at night, I still hear those 3 taps on the window. And I know we weren't alone in those woods. My name is Daniel Carter, and I'm a freelance photographer. I've spent years traveling to remote locations, capturing the untouched beauty of nature through my lens. But there's one place I'll never return to, the Smoky Mountains. In the fall of 2022, I was commissioned by a travel magazine to do a special feature on the autumn landscapes of the Smokies. I was thrilled. It was the perfect opportunity to capture mist-covered peaks, golden forests, and the untamed wilderness of one of the most beautiful national parks in America. I packed my gear, loaded up my SUV, and planned a solo trip deep into the heart of the mountains. My plan was simple. Set up camp for a few nights, wake up before dawn for sunrise shots, and hike to lesser-known locations to capture the raw beauty that tourists rarely see. I had no idea that this trip would haunt me for the rest of my life. I arrived at the park just before sunset. The trees were ablaze with color, the air crisp with the scent of autumn leaves. I had picked a remote campsite, miles away from any other campers. It was exactly what I wanted. No distractions, just me and the wild. The first night was uneventful. I took a few night shots, capturing the eerie beauty of the forest under the moonlight. The silence was almost peaceful, except for the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. But everything changed the next morning. I woke before dawn, eager to get the perfect sunrise shot. My plan was to hike a few miles up a ridge where I could get a panoramic view of the valley below. I had scouted the location on my map the night before, and it seemed like the perfect spot. As I hiked up the trail, the mist hung low, weaving through the trees like ghostly fingers. The deeper I went, the quieter the forest became. No birds, no wind, just an unsettling stillness that made my skin crawl. I should have turned back right then, but I didn't. About 2 miles in, I found an abandoned wooden structure, an old, weathered cabin, half collapsed and covered in moss. It wasn't on my map, and I'd never heard of any settlements in this part of the park. My curiosity got the best of me. I pulled out my camera and started snapping photos. There was something surreal about the way the fog curled around the broken beams, the way the morning light barely touched the rotting wood. But then, as I adjusted my lens, I noticed something that made my blood turn to ice. Through the viewfinder, I saw movement inside the cabin. I lowered my camera, my heart pounding. The cabin was silent, still, abandoned. But I knew what I had seen. Something had moved inside. I hesitated before raising my camera again, zooming in on the dark doorway. My hands trembled as I focused the lens. And then I saw it. A figure. Standing just inside the doorway. Not an animal, not a trick of the light. A person. But there was something wrong about them. Their proportions seemed off. Their limbs too long, their head slightly tilted in an unnatural way. I blinked, and in that split second, they vanished. I took a step back, my breath coming in short gasps. My first instinct was to run, but a part of me, my photographer's instinct, kept me rooted in place. Had I imagined it? Had the mist played tricks on my eyes? I snapped another photo of the doorway, my hands shaking. And then, from somewhere deep in the forest, I heard it. A voice. Software. Whispering. Calling my name. I turned and bolted, nearly dropping my camera. The trail back should have been easy to follow. I had marked it. I knew the way. But the fog had thickened, swallowing the trees, twisting my surroundings into something unrecognizable. My heartbeat pounded in my ears as I stumbled through the underbrush, desperate to get back to camp. Then I heard the voice again, closer this time. Daniel. I whipped around, my breath catching in my throat. No one was there. But then, movement, not behind me, beside me. I turned slowly, my skin crawling. Just a few feet away, partially obscured by the mist, something was standing between the trees, tall, motionless, watching me. I couldn't make out its face, just the outline of a head, shoulders, impossibly long arms. And then, it moved. Not like a person, not like an animal. It shifted, almost gliding between the trees, its body too smooth, too unnatural. I ran. I don't remember how long I ran, but by some miracle I stumbled back into my campsite, my lungs burning, my legs weak. I threw myself into my SUV, locked the doors, and didn't look back. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the doors locked, my headlights on, my camera clutched in my shaking hands. At dawn, I sped out of the park, not stopping until I was miles away. It took me days before I could bring myself to look at the photos. Most were exactly what I expected. Misty landscapes, eerie trees, the abandoned cabin. But then, I found the last one I'd taken, the doorway of the cabin. And there, in the shadows, The figure was still standing there. Except this time, it wasn't looking at the camera. It was looking directly at me. I don't talk about this often. People wouldn't believe me, but I know what I saw. And I know one thing for sure. Something is out there in the Smoky Mountains. Something ancient, something watching. And if you ever find yourself hiking alone, and you hear a voice calling your name from the trees, don't answer. I've been RV camping for years. I've camped in deserts, deep forests, by lakes, in the mountains. Name it, I've been there. I always thought of myself as someone who didn't scare easily. That changed one October night in the Smoky Mountains. I had been driving down from Virginia, heading south before winter set in. I had no specific destination, just following the roads, stopping wherever felt right. I'd read about some great secluded camping spots on the North Carolina side of the Smokies, so I figured I'd give it a shot. I reached the campsite late in the afternoon, around 5 p.m. It was one of those primitive sites, meaning no hookups, no electricity, just you and nature. It was perfect. Surrounded by towering trees, the air was crisp with the scent of pine and damp earth. The golden hues of fall were in full bloom, and aside from the occasional distant bird call, it was dead silent. Too silent. That should have been my first clue. After parking the RV, I let my dog, Max, out to stretch his legs. He's a black Labrador mix, a tough dog, protective but not aggressive. The moment I opened the door, he bolted out like normal, then stopped mid-stride. His tail went stiff and his ears perked straight up. I frowned. He'd never reacted like that before. "Come on, buddy," I called. He didn't move. He was staring at the tree line, the fur along his spine bristling. I followed his gaze, scanning the trees. I didn't see anything, but something about that patch of woods made my stomach twist. The trees were so thick that the deeper parts were nearly pitch black, even though the sun hadn't fully set yet. I shook off the unease and set up camp. But Max, he never fully relaxed. Even while I made a fire and cooked dinner, he kept looking into the woods, ears twitching. I told myself he was just smelling a deer or a bear. But deep down, I knew it was something else. By nightfall, the temperature had dropped. I decided to call it an early night and climbed into the RV. I locked the doors, always do when I camp alone, and lay down in my bed at the back of the RV. Max curled up at my feet, still a little on edge. Sometime around midnight, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. The forest outside was completely silent. No wind, no crickets, just dead stillness. I've camped enough to know that's never a good sign. Then, I heard it. Crunch. A footstep, not an animal, too heavy, too deliberate. I held my breath. Crunch. Another step. I reached over and grabbed my flashlight, slowly sitting up. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it. Max's ears twitched, but he didn't growl. He just lifted his head, staring at the RV door. His body was completely rigid. Someone, or something, was outside. I clicked on the flashlight, shining it through the side window. Nothing. I waited, listening. Silence. I almost convinced myself I imagined it, that maybe it was just a branch falling. But then, tap, tap, tap. I almost dropped the flashlight. The sound came from the back window. I spun around, shining the beam toward the back of the RV, but all I saw was my own reflection in the glass. No movement, no figures, but I knew someone was standing right behind that window. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. Then came the whisper. It was faint, almost like the wind, but it was there. "Come outside. We see you." My chest tightened. The voice was wrong. It wasn't deep, wasn't high. It was just off, like someone mimicking human speech but not quite getting it right. I clenched the flashlight so tight my fingers ached. I wanted to believe it was just my imagination, that I was dreaming. But Max suddenly launched to his feet, snarling. And then the doorknob rattled. That was it. I wasn't waiting to find out what was out there. I lunged for the driver's seat, started the engine, and threw it into drive. The RV lurched forward, tires kicking up dirt as I tore out of that campsite. My headlights swept across the woods as I turned onto the road, and that's when I saw it. Standing just beyond the tree line was a tall, thin figure, barely visible between the trunks. Its eyes reflected the headlights, glowing like an animal's but too high off the ground. It didn't move, just watched as I sped past. I drove for an hour straight before stopping at a gas station near the highway. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely pump gas. Max was still on edge, staring at the windows. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, curiosity got the better of me. I posted about the experience in an online camping forum, asking if anyone had encountered something similar in the Smokies. The responses terrified me even more. One person said the area I camped in was known for disappearances. Another said they'd heard the same whispering voices when camping near there. A third said it sounded like the legends of the knot deer, a creature that mimics human voices to lure people into the woods. I don't know what I saw. I don't know who or what was outside my RV that night, but I do know this. I will never camp alone in the Smoky Mountains again. I should have trusted my gut. I'd been on plenty of RV trips before, but something about this one felt off from the start. My name is Jake, and this happened just last fall when I decided to take my RV deep into the Smoky Mountains National Park in North Carolina. I had always loved the isolation, the quiet, the crisp mountain air. But after this trip, I swore I'd never go back. It started as a peaceful retreat. I arrived at a lesser-known campsite off a gravel road, miles from the more popular areas. I wanted solitude, just me, my dog Max, and the towering trees around us. I parked, set up, and took in the scenery as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a deep amber glow through the trees. It was perfect. That first night, though, I hardly slept. Max, usually the most relaxed dog, kept growling lowly at the door. Every time I checked, there was nothing there, just darkness. The wind barely rustled the trees, and the only sound was the occasional hoot of an owl. I chalked it up to him sensing a deer or some other harmless animal. The next day, I hiked a nearby trail, breathing in the cool, fresh air. The feeling of unease from the night before faded as I immersed myself in nature. But as I was making my way back to camp, I noticed something odd. A pile of rocks, carefully stacked, stood on the path. I hadn't seen it earlier. Someone had placed it there recently. I shook it off and returned to my RV. That evening, I made a fire, grilled some food, and enjoyed the solitude. As the fire burned down to embers, I heard a sound, like whispering. My stomach tightened. I turned off my lantern and listened. The whispers were too faint to make out words, but they were close, just beyond the tree line. Max's ears perked up, and he let out a deep, guttural growl. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it into the trees. Nothing. Just endless black woods. I tried to sleep, but the sounds outside grew worse. Soft footfalls circling the RV, twigs snapping, and that same whispering. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't animals. Someone was out there. Around 2 a.m., I heard scratching on the RV door. Light at first, then more insistent. My heart pounded. I grabbed my knife and stood by the door, too afraid to make a sound. Max was rigid, staring at the door, his teeth bared. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the scratching stopped. Silence. No footsteps retreating. No rustling. Just dead, suffocating silence. I didn't sleep a second that night. At first light, I stepped outside, knife in hand, expecting to find claw marks or some sign of what had happened. But there was nothing. Not a single scratch on the RV. The only thing different was another stack of rocks, right next to my fire pit. I packed up immediately. As I started the RV and pulled onto the dirt road, I saw something in my rearview mirror. A figure, tall and thin, standing at the edge of the forest, watching me. It didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there as I sped away. I never looked back. Since then, I've tried to rationalize what happened. Maybe some backwoods camper was messing with me. Maybe my mind was playing tricks. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw. Never again. Not in the Smoky Mountains. I've always loved the outdoors. Something about the fresh mountain air and the quiet of the wilderness calls to me. That's why, last fall, I decided to take my RV out to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park in North Carolina. I had just finished a long stretch of work, and I needed a break. A real escape from the noise of the world. I planned to stay for a week, camp out in the woods, and enjoy some much-needed solitude. The first few days were everything I had hoped for. The leaves were turning brilliant shades of red and orange, and the air was crisp but not too cold. I spent my days hiking and my nights by the fire, enjoying the peace. But by the third night, something changed. Something I still struggle to explain. That night, I parked my RV at a secluded campsite deep in the woods. It wasn't an official campground, just a clearing I found off a dirt road. The only sound was the occasional hoot of an owl and the rustling of leaves in the wind. I had just finished eating and was sitting by the fire when I started to get an eerie feeling, like I was being watched. I chalked it up to my imagination, the way the woods can make you feel small and vulnerable when you're alone. Still, I decided to turn in early. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a faint tapping on the side of the RV. At first, I thought it was just a branch scraping against the metal, but when I listened closer, I realized it was rhythmic, deliberate. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. Then the tapping stopped. I waited, barely breathing, but everything was silent. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing and lay back down. But just as I was drifting off again, the tapping started once more. This time on the window. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it outside, but there was nothing there. Just trees and darkness. I tried to shake off the fear, telling myself it was probably a raccoon or some other curious animal. Still, I locked the doors and shut the curtains before crawling back into bed. Then, at around 3:30 a.m., I heard footsteps. Not an animal scurrying through the leaves, but slow, deliberate footsteps circling my RV. I held my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps would stop for a few seconds, then start again, moving around, pausing, then continuing. Someone was out there. My mind raced. Who the hell would be out here in the middle of the night? I reached for my phone, but of course there was no service. I grabbed the small knife I kept near my bed, not that it made me feel any safer. Then, suddenly, the footsteps stopped. Minutes passed, but I didn't dare move. My heart pounded in my chest, and my ears were ringing from the sheer silence. Just as I started to convince myself that whoever it was had left, something slammed against the side of my RV, hard. The whole vehicle shook. It was like someone had thrown their entire body against it. I jumped up and flicked on all the exterior lights, hoping to scare them off. But when I peeked outside, there was nothing. No movement, no sound, just an empty forest bathed in artificial light. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat there, knife in hand, waiting for whatever or whoever it was to come back. But they never did. As soon as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I packed up my RV and got the hell out of there. When I reached the nearest ranger station later that morning, I told them what had happened. They listened, but didn't seem surprised. One of them, an older guy who had worked in the park for years, told me that every now and then campers report strange things in the deeper parts of the woods. Most of the time we chalk it up to bears, or just the isolation messing with people's heads, he said. But some of the things folks have described, well, let's just say it's best to stick to the marked campgrounds. I don't know who or what was out there that night. I don't know if it was a person, an animal, or something else entirely. All I know is that I'm never camping alone in the Smoky Mountains again. Never. Again. Let me tell you something. I will never, ever camp in the Smoky Mountains again. I don't care how beautiful it is, how peaceful it looks, or how many people swear by the place. What happened to me that night is something I still can't explain, and I sure as hell don't want to experience anything like it ever again. It was October of last year. My name is Daniel, and I've been RV camping for years. I've seen it all. Strange noises in the woods, weird animal encounters, even a few unsettling people lurking around campgrounds. But nothing compares to what I went through in the Smokies. I had been on the road for weeks, traveling up and down the East Coast, and I decided to spend a few nights in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park in North Carolina. I pulled into a secluded campground, not one of the big, well-known ones, but a smaller, more isolated spot that I found on a camping forum. It was perfect. Quiet, deep in the woods, no light pollution, just nature all around me. Or so I thought. The first night was uneventful. I made a fire, cooked some dinner, and listened to the sounds of the forest. It was peaceful, the kind of peace that makes you feel small, like you're truly in the wild. I fell asleep easily in my RV, with nothing but the wind and the distant calls of owls outside. The second night, things got strange. It started with a smell. Around 9 p.m., I caught a whiff of something rotten, like decaying meat. I figured maybe an animal had died nearby, but the smell wasn't drifting in and out like you'd expect. It was strong, constant, like it was right outside my RV. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out to take a look around. Nothing, no sign of an animal, no trash, no reason for the smell. But as I stood there, I felt something. A presence. Like I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and suddenly, the forest around me felt different. Darker, heavier. I shrugged it off, went back inside, locked the doors, and tried to sleep. That's when the knocking started. It was soft at first. A light tapping on the side of my RV, like someone testing to see if I was awake. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. I knew I was alone. There were no other campers for at least a mile. I grabbed my knife and my flashlight and stayed quiet, listening. Then it happened again. Tap, tap, tap. This time from the back of the RV. I jumped out of bed, yanked open the curtains, and shined my flashlight outside. Nothing. Just trees and darkness. But that feeling of being watched? Stronger than ever. I told myself it had to be the wind, or maybe a branch tapping against the RV. I tried to go back to sleep, but I couldn't shake the unease. Then, at exactly 3:12 a.m., I heard something that chilled me to my core. A whisper, right outside my window. Not the wind, not an animal, a voice, low, raspy, and just barely audible. "Come out." I froze. My blood turned to ice. I didn't move, didn't breathe. "Come out, now." I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, but of course, there was no signal. The whispering stopped. For a moment there was silence, and then something hit my RV. Hard, like a body slamming against it. I lost it. I threw on my boots, jumped into the driver's seat, and fired up the engine. My headlights cut through the darkness as I peeled out of there, gravel flying. I didn't stop driving until I reached a well-lit gas station an hour away. When I finally stepped out, my legs were shaking. I checked the side of my RV where I heard the impact. There were handprints, human handprints. Smudged, dirty, like someone, or something, had pressed against my RV with unnatural force. I don't know what was out there in those woods. I don't know if it was a person playing a sick joke or something else entirely. But I do know one thing. I will never camp in the Smoky Mountains again. Never again. I've spent most of my life on the road, traveling in my RV, camping in remote places, and living for those quiet, peaceful nights under the stars. But there's one place I swore I'd never go back to: Smoky Mountains National Park in North Carolina. What happened to me there was so disturbing, so utterly unexplainable, that to this day, I struggle to talk about it without my hands shaking. It all happened in October 2022. I had just wrapped up a long trip through the Midwest and wanted to spend some time in the mountains before heading south for the winter. I had always heard about the Smokies, how beautiful, serene, and untouched they were. I found a remote campground deep in the park, the kind of place where you rarely see another soul for miles. That's exactly what I wanted: solitude, nature, and a break from people. I arrived in the late afternoon, parked my RV, and set up camp. The sun was dipping behind the mountains, casting long shadows through the trees, and a cool mist began creeping into the valley. It was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're being watched. But I brushed it off as just my imagination and set up a small fire to keep me warm. That first night, I sat by my fire, enjoying the stillness. The only sounds were the crackling of the wood and the occasional rustling of leaves as the wind picked up. Then, just as I was about to turn in for the night, I heard something. A whisper. It was faint, distant, but unmistakably human. I turned my head sharply, scanning the darkness beyond my firelight. The whispering continued, murmured voices, impossible to make out but undeniably there. My first thought was that maybe someone else was camping nearby, but I hadn't seen another RV or tent for miles. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" Silence. I stood up, my flashlight beaming into the trees, but I saw nothing. The whispering had stopped. Maybe it was just the wind. Maybe I was just tired from the long drive. I convinced myself of that and climbed into my RV, locking the doors behind me. The next morning, I woke up to find my fire pit disturbed, like someone, or something, had been messing with it. The logs were scattered, and there were footprints in the dirt. They weren't mine. I tried to brush it off, telling myself maybe an animal had come through in the night. But deep down, something felt wrong. That evening, the mist rolled in even heavier than before. By the time night fell, the fog was so thick I could barely see a few feet beyond my fire. I stayed close to my RV, feeling uneasy but not sure why. Then, as I sat there, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. A shadow. Not just one, several. I saw them shifting through the fog, barely visible, watching from the tree line. My heart started pounding. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it at the figures, but there was nothing there. I told myself I was just seeing things, that the fog was playing tricks on me. But the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I couldn't take it anymore. I put out the fire, locked myself inside the RV, and lay in my bed, listening. That's when I heard it. Light tapping on my RV walls. It started on one side, then another, then the back. A slow, deliberate tapping, like someone testing the walls. My breath caught in my throat. Who the hell was out there? I grabbed my knife, stood frozen, and waited. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I barely slept that night. Every small sound made me jump. I told myself I was leaving first thing in the morning. I didn't care how beautiful this place was. I was done. Morning came, and I forced myself to shake it off. Maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe I'd let my imagination get the best of me. So I decided to stay one more night. Biggest mistake of my life. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a loud knock on my RV door. 3 knocks, not the light tapping from before. This was loud, heavy, deliberate. I shot up in bed, my heart racing. My mind was screaming at me, "Do not open the door." But curiosity got the better of me. Slowly, I pulled back the curtain on the side window, and my blood ran cold. There, standing just outside my RV door, was a figure. Tall, thin, wearing what looked like old-fashioned clothing, like something out of the 1800s. But the worst part? It had no face, just smooth, pale skin where a face should have been. I stumbled backward, my breath caught in my throat. I scrambled for my keys, shaking as I jammed them into the ignition. I didn't even put on shoes. I just started the engine and floored it. As I sped away down the dirt road, I saw them in my mirrors. More figures emerging from the fog, standing in the trees, watching me leave. I drove until I reached a gas station an hour away, parked under the bright lights, and tried to calm myself. I stayed there until sunrise. I never told anyone about this until now. I don't know what I saw. I don't know who or what was out there. But I do know one thing. I will never, ever go back to that place. Some people say the Smoky Mountains are haunted. That, long ago, entire families vanished into the woods, never to be seen again. That the spirits of old settlers, lost hikers, and something even older than that still linger there. I don't know if that's true. All I know is what happened to me. And if you ever find yourself camping alone in the Smoky Mountains, and you hear whispers in the fog or tapping on your RV, leave immediately. Because I made the mistake of staying one extra night. And I was lucky to get out.